So my first question is for you, Avi. We've spoken twice before, and you were waiting on some funds. You got a big benefactor, but now there's a collaboration with Mr. Elizondo right here and Mr. Christopher Mellon. Um, Now, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on how this collaboration came to life?
Well, we spoke a few weeks ago, and I offered both of them to join us as research affiliates. And by now, we have about 100 people engaged in the Galileo project, with many more supporting us financially or willing to help us in other ways. And it's quite remarkable because some of the scientists, for example, told me that they waited for such an opportunity for a long time, and this subject was stigmatized. And here came the Galileo Project, which gives them a safe space, so to speak, to do what they really want. And there is a lot of excitement. We are currently buying instruments that we will put together as the first telescope system on the roof of the Center for Astrophysics at Harvard University. That will be really the first system that we will test. We will provide the software necessary for identifying objects, whether they are birds, drones, airplanes. And then when the system works, hopefully by the end of the spring 2022, we will make copies of it and put it in various locations. So it's really about getting data and evidence and shying away from the prejudice that prevailed both in the scientific community and other quarters of society. And that was really inappropriate because this is a subject of great interest to the general public. I should say that the tent of the Galileo Project is pretty wide. I also include the people that are skeptical about an extraterrestrial interpretation of these unidentified aerial phenomena. For example, Michael Shermer, in the last team meeting, he expressed statistical doubts about such an interpretation. And I told him, okay, well, it's not about statistics. If we have good enough evidence, it will be clear to everyone what the interpretation is. And that's what the Galileo Project is all about. I don't care about the initial opinions of people. It's science is making progress by collecting evidence. And he agreed that if the evidence would be beyond a reasonable doubt, he said, I will be glad to report about it in my magazine, Skeptic. He has a magazine called Skeptic. So I told him, no, that's an insufficient gesture as far as I'm concerned. I want you to change the name of your magazine from Skeptic to Believer.
Well, that's great. That's great. Now, Avi, what is going to change now? You're collaborating with Mr. Elizondo and Mr. Mellon. What is it going to be? That's going to be the biggest asset to the Galileo Project, working with these great men.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, their intelligence and wisdom, but also their knowledge base. They were thinking about this subject for many years, and we aim to benefit. Now, we don't want any information that is classified. Obviously, they cannot provide it because they're signed on agreements with the government, and we don't seek it. But if there is a way for them to guide us, and there are several different possible directions. For example, what kind of instruments we might want to use, what kind of locations we might want to place the telescope systems in, what are the societal implications if we find something. These are areas where they can contribute a lot.
Sure. My next question is for you, Lou. I know you're still muted, so just warning. So my question to you is, of course, we met up in San Marino. There was a lot of important work going on, a big international effort in pursuit of disclosure, or working together to work towards disclosure, or whatever UAP is. Now, you already were busy promoting the use of artificial intelligence. Now, also, you've shown the world the 5-pillar system. Now, is this something you are going to be using in the Galileo project? Is this going to be an asset for Avi and his team?
Yeah, let me see if I can unpackage that question a little bit, Max. First of all, let me throw out a couple names: Sir Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and Stephen Hawking. Right. Um, some of the most paradigm changing moments for our species occurs in the world of academia. That's just the bottom line, and you can see in time and time again where it's the great thinkers that really wind up solving hard problems, difficult challenges, and that's precisely what we have here with the Galileo Project under the leadership of Avi Loeb, and the work with some of his colleagues at Harvard, and we've got some folks at Stanford and some other folks that are reaching out, believe it or not, even Oxford now and possibly Cambridge. Look, if you want to, if you want to be an investigator, you don't necessarily have to be an academic. But if you want to find solutions, there's a good chance you need some academic expertise. And that's just the bottom line. So I think it makes sense that we have this partnership. As far as the five pillars, we talked about the five pillars. Think of them as verticals, right? Five vertical columns holding up the roof. But then you have these cross-cutting initiatives that go across all five of those. And academia, technology, and science are absolutely those cross-cutting initiatives. You can't have talk about those pillars without talking about the input from academia at every single one of those levels. So whether it's discussions with the legislative branch or discussions with the executive branch, discussions with the media, discussions with foreign nationals and our allies, or even with the general public writ large, academia has to be firmly in the cockpit with you. They have to be seated side by side. Otherwise, chances are you're not going to get very far with those five pillars. If the five pillars are, if you will, what's holding up the roof, think of academia as the mortar that holds the stones together in those pillars. It's the glue, if you will.
Yes.
Oh,
we can't hear you. We cannot hear you yet.
Chris, you're on mute.
Sorry about the delay. I had some technical issues.
No problem. We're delighted you're here, especially the people who were so excited to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. Could you maybe give your side of why it was so important for you to join the Galileo Project alongside Mr. Elizondo?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. Obviously, the government doesn't have a monopoly on science or intelligence. In fact, if anything, it's more the reverse. There's immense talent out there that would like to be involved, and it's frustrating to know and work with people who would like to contribute, who are not able to in the scientific community. I think it's very important to bridge those gaps where we can, and I'm delighted to try to play a role in facilitating that. And almost every great thing is accomplished through collaboration of people, and this is a good example. I think it's a win-win for the government and the scientific community.
Yes, especially now with Senator Gillibrand pulling her weight, or the Senate's weight, which is a very exciting news. I know you've been very vocal about that, Mr. Mellon. Do you think now more and more people in the Senate or in the government are not talking about if UAP is real, but how are we going to determine what it is? So is your collaboration with the Galileo Project, is that also something that is going to press the government more to invest more in UAP investigation?
I'd like to think so. It's another activity that raises public awareness. Dr. Loeb has played a critical role in that regard with his award-winning book, staking and taking a very brave and originally unique position on this issue. He's been the first really to break ranks with the scientific academic community and say this is really serious and legitimate and we need to look at it. So all of these things are very helpful. And the biggest problem that we had from the outset when Lue and I approached the government was simply lack of information. Once the members of Congress began to appreciate what was really happening, once they started talking to the Navy pilots and so forth, then they engaged. The facts, to a large extent, speak for themselves and motivate people. So generally speaking, the more that we can spread the word and share information and collaborate, the better.
Yes. Lou, this is a question for you. You have been engaging the general public through people like me. Now, alongside Mr. Loeb and disclosure through the like podcasts like this, is this something that is connected to the 5-pillar system? Is this something you'd like to, that goes hand in hand, to say?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned that before. Academia plays a critical role in all the 5 pillars of our engagement, whether it's executive branch engagement, legislative branch engagement, the media, international community, or even the private sector, because it cuts across all of those. And as I mentioned before, Chris wasn't here for this, but if the 5 pillars are what we're using to hold up the roof, so to speak, on this disclosure, as I mentioned, I think academia, the world of academia, is the glue. It's the mortar of each one of those pillars that holds them all together. And I don't think you can have a discussion about this topic without academia coming in. Again, because I've mentioned the few names I mentioned, like Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein and Sir Isaac Newton. These are folks that were able to make sense from nonsense, and you must have academia. And I think the Galileo Project plays a critical role in that. And also, let me backtrack real quick. Chris, thanks for joining us. I think the IQ, I made a statement that when I logged on, the IQ dropped by quite a bit, and so I think you brought that back up to the standard it was supposed to be. So I'm glad you joined. Secondly, I want to also expound real quick on what Avi said about spirituality and space. There's a reason why historically we refer to the sky and space as the heavens. I've had a chance to talk to quite a few individuals, religious figures on all sides, whether they're Buddhist or Muslim or Christian or Jewish. There's a sense of spirituality. There's a thread of spirituality through most religions, and I think space it's natural that when one has a conversation about space, spirituality is part of it, because it's the great unknown, right? It's the great void, and in a lot of religious texts, you do see reference to that. So I don't think it's out of the ordinary. Back to the Galileo Project, I think we're going to see the value that the Galileo Project has on this topic each and every day. I also want to warn people, look, there's a lot of things happening subsurface. I've mentioned this before, that our effort is a lot like a submarine. Sometimes you just don't see it until you see it, but it's there. There's a lot happening. And the work that Avi is doing in the Galileo Project is part of that. They're doing a monumental amount of effort trying to A, destigmatize this topic, but B, bring in real academic rigor and academic vitae to look at this, individuals with academic vitae to try to help us figure this out. And this is exactly what we needed. And it took someone like Avi to spearhead that initiative.
Now, if I may just say something, thank you so much, Lou and Chris, but my role, the way I see it, is similar to this kid in the Danish folk tale that said the emperor has no clothes. And here the emperor is the mainstream of the scientific community that was ridiculing the subject, and I think without good reason, because by now we have intriguing evidence, and that should intrigue all of us to search for more evidence to figure out the nature of these objects that are unusual near Earth. And indeed, that's the purpose of the Galileo Project. And I should say, before Einstein, before Newton, was Galileo Galilei, and he established the foundation for modern science. And what he provided is the idea that we should rely on what we see through our telescopes, not on our prejudice, because people at the time thought the sun moves around the Earth. And the philosophers refused to look through his telescope. They knew it for sure. And if they were today, they would have canceled it on social media. Now, they put him instead on house arrest, and he wasn't allowed to publish, wasn't allowed to interact with other people. We don't want to repeat that mistake. I was on house arrest for the last year or so because of the pandemic. What I'm trying to do through the Galileo Project is bring this subject to the mainstream of science where it belongs, because, it's one of these subjects the public cares about. We can draw more funds into science if we engage in it, and we can bring more talent into science if we engage in it. And the Galileo Project is a demonstration of all of that. And, in this forum in Washington, there was a long line of people after the event was over waiting to tell me that, how meaningful this project is for them. And, my goal in the coming years is to justify their trust.
Well, Mr. Loeb, let me elaborate on the work at hand and what you're about to do. I have a question. The Galileo Project was designated for representatives in the astro legislation working in the classified realm. Will this association with DoD's astro in a way impede the free flow of public information from the Galileo Project if there were a conflict within the DoD?
Well, that's an excellent question. So the Galileo Project is dealing primarily with open data, only with open data that will be available to other scientists. And it's a research endeavor that will assemble its own data and make it open and transparent. And the analysis will be published in scientific journals, just like science is done. Now, you're asking me, what do we think about the Gillibrand Amendment? I strongly support it, and I strongly support involvement of scientists in the advisory committee that will be established.
Okay.
And they could be selected from within the Galileo Project as long as what they are doing there is not overlapping with what is being done in the Galileo Project. In other words, the Galileo Project, the research itself, is dealing with open data.
Right, but there's one concern though. The concern is that if an official government presence is there, with the government clearances though, but is there, can that be an influence on what is going to be shared to the citizen? Is there?
So the data that we assemble is obtained from telescopes we buy off the shelf, that we have full control over. The sky is not classified. So that data, the government doesn't own that data, because the government owns only data that was collected by government-owned sensors, okay? So in that regard, there will be no limitations on the data we collect. It will be just like data that astronomers collect about the sky. I was asked at Harvard by the administration whether the Galileo Project is part of my day job. And my answer was simple. Throughout the last few decades as an astronomer, I analyzed data collected by telescopes. And it's exactly the same thing that we will do with the Galileo Project. We'll collect data from telescopes and analyze it. And there is no limit on how close an object in astronomy could be relative to us. We are dealing with the sun, with meteors, with asteroids, with comets that are relatively nearby. So this is a project within the realm of astronomy, and it's a scientific research project. Now, at the same time, the government owns data that the only people with sufficient clearance can look at. But that has nothing to do with the routine of the Galileo Project, where we are engaged with open data. So I don't see any contradiction. I see these two efforts as complementary, and I do think that the Gillibrand Amendment will bring more transparency, more cooperation within the different government sections that did not speak to each other about this subject before.
Right.
Hey, Max, I'd like to jump on that too. Oh, Chris, you want to go first, and I'll go after you if you like. I'd like to jump on that as well.
Very
Mr.
briefly, one of the great things about the Gillibrand Amendment is that it requires continuing unclassified reports issued to the public. So if that amendment doesn't pass, there is no requirement, no demand on the executive branch to produce any more unclassified reports. The second thing is that there are already some people associated with the Galileo Project who are exposed to classified information but don't share it like Lue and I. It's not relevant. It's not pertinent. They don't want it. We don't provide it. And
Do you reject it, Avi?
We can still collaborate.
I don't want it. I don't want my hands to be tied with knowing information that could influence the way that we do the research. So, yes, I'm not interested in it.
And Max, look, there's examples in recent history where you have academia and others involved with U.S. government, in some cases classified work for the betterment of everybody. Let me give you an example here. So Chris is actually can tell you more about this than I can, but climate change, for example, water pollution, urban development, sustainable farming, and even renewable energy. There are task forces that have been created that are both civilian and governmental organizations where they work and collaborate with one another and share information at the unclassified level to try to solve big issues, big problems. Yes, you might have a classified satellite that takes certain measurements at a certain altitude, but that information is very important when you're looking at climate change, and you got to get that information out in a consumable way to the private sector. So I think this relationship is a natural one. I think it's exactly where it needs to be. There's been a precedence of these other type of efforts happening in the past to solve other big problems. Why wouldn't we want to do this?
Yes. I have one more thing here on this issue, and that is that I believe there's a lot of information in government channels not available to the public, which is either currently unclassified or could readily be declassified. And one of the things that we can do on that panel is help to be advocates for that and review that. Lue and I have both seen videos that are nearly identical in every way to the ones that have been released. They couldn't possibly damage national security, but they haven't been released. Right. And I think there's a considerable more data like that. We'd like to see more of that shared with the public and the scientific community.
Now, Mr. Mellon, to elaborate on that a little bit, of course, you have seen much more than you could ever share with someone like me or Avi. But what do you think is your personal asset you're going to bring to the Galileo Project? What is the main thing you are willing to focus on to help this project become a huge success in pursuit of disclosure?
Sure. So one of the things I can help with a bit, I think, is where to locate some of this instrumentation, where we may have ideas of where there's a considerable amount of activity. Thus far, early on in the process, because of the time I've spent working on this, I've been able to identify some other civilian groups, actually, that have complementary hardware or software that the group was not aware of. I've been able to bring that into the discussion. And also, I have a little bit of a different perception on this issue of disclosure and how it might impact society. And I think Lue does too, because we've been involved with that and we've seen some of the initial steps and how people react. So mostly, I think my job is to help facilitate coordination and information flow. And I'm delighted to be a part of the project.
Oh, great. Just one more question for you, Mr. Mellon, maybe for you too, Lue. You were talking about locations, where to set up these telecom systems. My question is, have you ever considered working with the Hesdalen team and the locations they were using?
I'm aware of the team and the work in Norway. And that's great. And there's no reason there can't be information sharing, but that's a little far away for me.
All right. Thoughts, Avi?
Yeah. Well, first I wanted to comment that in this National Cathedral Forum, both Bill Nelson and Avril Haines were asked, what are the most exciting projects in your organization? And they said, we cannot speak about them. They're classified in both organizations.
Right.
Gladly, I represented the Galileo Project, and the most exciting aspect of the Galileo Project would be unclassified. So guess what? That's exactly what we need. And of course, we need some guidance from classified, people that may have seen classified data but are not allowed to speak about it. But the idea of the Galileo Project is first to bring this subject to the mainstream of science so that very intelligent people will be engaged without worrying about stigma. And that's already happening. All members of the Galileo Project are extremely excited about the prospect of getting that evidence. We are putting the hardware together, and it's not a philosophical question. We're trying to get data. And the second aspect is that, aside from providing this safe space for those people, scientists that are interested and excited about it, there is a way for us to harvest low-hanging fruit. There is this poem by Robert Frost that about taking the road not taken, and he said it made all the difference for him to take the road not taken from two paths in the woods. I would add to that if you take a road that was not taken, there is a chance that there might be a lot of low-hanging fruit there. And if you're doing a scientific research project that was never done before, there was never a group of scientists trying to assemble their own data through telescopes with software that uses artificial intelligence, machine learning to identify objects, track them. There was never something like that. There is a chance that we will pick low-hanging fruit.
Sure. Let's elaborate on that a little bit, because low-hanging fruit could be UAP showing up at sites where there's either nuclear weapons or systems where there's nuclear weapons or nuclear plants, right? Those are very significant locations for UAP showing up. Now, if I were you, Mr. Loeb, I would make sure I would set up a camera system there. But now these things are also transmedium. So what is just a telescope or a clear picture enough to determine location and what this is?
Right.
And maybe this is a question for all of you.
Yeah, so you have to keep in mind that in science there is a concept called selection effect, which means that, if you are looking under the lamppost, you will find keys under the lamppost. You can't find them elsewhere. So if there are lots of instruments monitoring the sky near sensitive areas like nuclear plants, military facilities, that's where you will find UAP. But that doesn't mean that UAP are only there. When you see flies next to a lamppost because they're illuminated, flies are everywhere, but in the dark regions, you can't see them. So the point is, what we know is not necessarily where UAP are, and of course we cannot monitor the sky that are in areas that are classified. We don't want to break the law, but we will try to avoid areas that are classified and look at the sky where it's not classified. And most of the sky is not classified. And you may ask, okay, well, astronomers looked at the sky for many, many decades. They haven't seen anything. Well, that's not true. When a bird flies above a telescope, the astronomers ignore it. They don't monitor it. They don't have the software to track a moving body above their head. And that's the kind of objects we will be interested in. So this was never done before. It's really a path not taken.
Sure. This question is for both Mr. Mellon and Mr. Elizondo. Gentlemen, do you think it's sufficient enough to just first for the Galileo project to develop new camera systems or telescopes, or should they work towards the 5 observables, maybe create systems that can analyze signature, exotic materials, go under the ocean, see what's there, because the phenomenon is transmedium clearly. What do you guys think?
You want to jump on this one first, Chris?
All right.
Okay.
Well, first of all, the project is not limited to cameras. I mean, they're looking at audio data, for example, and I was able to connect them with a global network that's part of an arms control monitoring system that I brought to their attention that actually can track meteorites and bolides through audio waves. And so that's an example of data that hasn't been tapped for this purpose, hasn't been used, that's available. I don't think the team is blinkered by or limited to any particular kind of phenomenology. But obviously they have to start somewhere and put the resources where they're most likely to be effective. And I think that's exactly what they're doing.
And, I'll jump on that too. Look, you can there's a lot of data you can glean from good optical data collection platforms. Let's not forget that with a simple telescope, we were able to identify all the celestial bodies in our solar system. We were able to determine their velocities and orbital speeds. We determined their size and their mass. We were able to determine a whole lot right now through some of the Doppler processing. We're looking at the farthest reaches of our universe simply with just really good telescopes. I think what Avi and his team are trying to do is, like Chris said, you got to start somewhere, right? And you can't eat the elephant all in one bite. First of all, no one has this kind of resources, and you have to build up to it. So I think it's a logical step the way that the Galileo team is pushing forward, and frankly, I'm very, very optimistic that there are going to be some really, really good results coming from it.
For sure. Avi, question for you. Okay. So Oumuamua has Doppler changes in its illumination pattern.
That we heard. So what is the question?
The question is that must further convince you that it's not following a Keplerian trajectory and that it's even accelerating and decelerating. What do you think, Avi?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we did monitor its motion in the sky, and we figured that, in fact, there is a force pushing it away from the sun, and that force declined inversely with distance squared. And since it was not evaporating, we didn't see any carbon-based molecules or any dust around it. It didn't look like a comet. There couldn't be a rocket effect. So the only explanation I could think of is that it's a very thin object, sort of like a sail being pushed by reflecting sunlight. And in September 2020, there was another object that shared the same qualities. It was given the name 2020 SO, discovered by the same telescope in Hawaii. And within a few weeks, the astronomers realized it's actually a rocket booster that had very thin walls that was launched in 1966 as part of a lunar lander mission. And we know that this object just had thin walls because it was a rocket booster. And it was pushed by reflecting sunlight as a result. And it didn't have cometary tail, obviously. We know that it's artificial, and it was produced by us. The question is, who produced Oumuamua? And I should say this object was cylindrical. An interesting anecdote is that the name Galileo originates from the northern part of Israel, Galilee. And in Hebrew, Galilee means a cylinder.
Right. And, okay. So let me ask you this now. Many UAP testimonials refer to classes of morphology: saucers, tic tacs, cigar-shaped craft, or simply orbs. How big is the chance that Oumuamua is a shiny tic tac? Because you just elaborated on that. Reflective, shiny. Could it be a tic tac, a huge tic tac?
Yeah, we don't know its purpose, its intent. And all we can say is if indeed it was pushed by reflecting sunlight, just like 2020 SO, it must have been very thin. And, it could have been, for example, a receiver tumbling every 8 hours. What's clear from the reflected sunlight is that it was most likely flat at the 90% confidence, pancake shaped. And, it doesn't sound to me like a rock of the type that we have seen before. And in fact, the scientific community tried to argue again and again and again and again, 4 times, that it's natural by suggesting objects that we've never seen before, like a cloud of dust particles, or a hydrogen iceberg, or a nitrogen iceberg. These are things we've never seen before. They wanted to explain the anomalies of Oumuamua this way. And my point is, if it's something we've never seen before, we better contemplate the possibility that it's artificial. And I worked in astrophysics on many different subjects, on the cosmology, the study of the universe, the first stars, on black holes. And in all of these contexts, it was standard practice that when something anomalous shows up, you come up with potential explanations, and then you try to rule them out by evidence. Okay, that's a standard practice. There was never a personal attack, or when you do that in the other context. like, for example, the nature of dark matter. We don't know what it is, most of the matter in the universe, and people suggested, speculated, maybe it's weakly interacting massive particles. So then hundreds of millions of dollars were put into experiments trying to see what the dark matter is. We haven't found it 40 years later. But when I say Oumuamua could have been artificial, people attack me personally. I found that really strange, because if we were to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in trying to figure out the nature of objects like Oumuamua by sending spacecrafts equipped with a camera that comes close to such an object, takes a high-resolution image of it, so we can tell the difference between a rock and an artificial object. If we were to invest hundreds of millions of dollars and not find anything artificial in 40 years, we would be at exactly the same point as dark matter searches are right now. So how can you make that part of the mainstream of science and not look for things that look really strange and try to figure out if they are extraterrestrial in origin? To me, it sounds like common sense. I grew up on a farm. I'm just trying to advocate for common sense. I'm not, and I arrived at this subject by chance, because this object showed up. If this object would not show up, I wouldn't have an agenda on this subject.
Sure. And as we say in Holland, if you don't shoot, you always miss. So that's basically what it is. Mr. Mellon, I have a question for you. Of course, you've been working as the Secretary of Defense for a long time, former Secretary of Defense, Homeland Security. Now, Ms. Gillibrand and her new amendment, she and I think a lot of people within the DoD, Secret Service, and the government are now leaning towards the phenomenon being extraterrestrial. The deduction is it adversary? Is it swamp gas? Is it the bird? Is it the plane? Is it Superman? It's basically nobody has ever determined it's any of those things. From your personal perspective or professional perspective, how big do you think the chances that whatever the phenomenon is extraterrestrial, and we should look at it like that, also scientifically?
I'm reluctant to speculate, first of all. I mean, I think what this is all about is getting more data. And sometimes speculation can help you form hypotheses that you can test, and it can be useful in that sense. But I don't know that the problem is we don't have enough data yet to make that determination. And actually, sometimes speculation can be counterproductive, as it can be in this case. With regard to DoD, most of the people in the Pentagon who are involved in this do not think it's extraterrestrial. And many of them are skeptical about that, at least. And it's hard for some of them to form the words. And you notice they created in that report, they created the category other. They don't even have a category for extraterrestrial. So they're still having a hard time getting used to this new world. But the point is, as we gather and collect and analyze more data, it'll start to come into focus for all of us. And then we'll hopefully get to the bottom of this and find the truth, whatever it may be.
Sure. Mr. Loeb, I know you have to temper your excitement maybe a little bit as a scientist to even mention the word. It could be ET. You have been very vocal about it. It could be it's a possibility. But to what extent is what you are doing right now politics, trying to be as objective as possible towards the research and the phenomenon at hand? And when can you release your enthusiasm and actually pursue if this is extraterrestrial or not?
Yeah, so I channel my enthusiasm to experimental search for evidence. You see, that's really the key for making progress in our knowledge. Because I always give the example of Bernie Madoff that suggested to people a beautiful idea that if they give him their money, he will make more of it irrespective of the stock market. And they thought it's a beautiful idea. He thought it's a beautiful idea. They gave him the money, and then the experiment was done and he was put in jail. And my point is, you can have beautiful ideas like the multiverse, like a string theory landscape, as long as you don't have a path to testing those ideas, experimentally, they will not advance our knowledge, scientific knowledge about reality. And the beautiful thing about the possibility that there is equipment from other civilizations near Earth is that we can do the search. And it was not done scientifically speaking. It was anecdotal. Military personnel saw things they don't understand. We noticed Oumuamua that didn't behave like a comet or an asteroid. My point is simple. Here is something intriguing. The public cares a lot about it. The public funds science. We have an obligation as scientists to attend to it. And that's why I'm enthusiastic about it. A colleague of mine heard a talk about Oumuamua and said, Oumuamua is so weird, I wish it never existed. So that's pretty much the approach of people that want to be treated as experts, that everything we already know must explain everything we will see, because they don't want to taint their image with uncertainty. They know everything. My problem with that is that it's contradictory to the spirit of science. Science is about learning something new. And the way to learn something new is if you see something unusual, you examine it, you study it, you look for more evidence, which is exactly what we need to do about UAP and about objects like Oumuamua.
Sure. Mr. Loeb, some very renowned scientists like Einstein have belief systems that sometimes contradict their own discovery. In the early days of the discovery of laws that govern the world of smallest particles, quantum mechanics, he stated, God doesn't roll the dice. If you listen to your passionate exposés about Oumuamua, it seems you are a true believer in extraterrestrial expeditions into our solar system. But just as Lue and other smart people, you have to be careful. Do you agree that there is the official public and almost religious private Avi, Mr. Loeb, the official public Mr. Loeb and the private Mr. Loeb? Are you much more openly convinced of visits already going on to our Earth? Or is that something you still won't elaborate on?
Well, as a scientist, I'm intrigued by the anomalies we know about. And that includes the ODNI report to Congress on June 25th. And the point is, it's intriguing enough for us to get more data and figure it out. That's the fundamental point, that there is an action item for scientists to pursue. And when we pursue this action item, we will get to the bottom of it. And ignoring it is just inappropriate at this point. And I think that, it's a learning experience, and I'm willing to be wrong in terms of the interpretation of Oumuamua. Einstein was wrong 3 times at the end, the last decade of his career. He argued that black holes do not exist, gravitational waves do not exist, quantum mechanics doesn't have spooky action at a distance. It's part of a learning experience. And if we are modest, we're not pretending that we know much more than we actually know. The most vivid memory I have from my childhood was asking a question, and the adults in the room would pretend that they know the answer, even though they didn't know the answer. And very often they would dismiss the question and argue that it's not an interesting question just because they didn't know the answer. And I thought that becoming a scientist, I would just pursue my childhood curiosity and be surrounded by like-minded people. But what I find is it's not the case.
Yeah. All right. With the Galileo Project, are you encouraging the Galileo Project or Mr. Loeb to start working together, for example, with Skyhub or the or other organizations like NASA? Avi, you've been calling out Nelson for a while, and I was wondering, has he responded or has Elon responded? So my question is, can there be a huge effort with all these organizations?
Look, I think collaboration is essential. It is in the spirit of academia to do so. It's in the very ethos of discovery, right? You have to collaborate, and you have to have peer review, and you also, it's not a monopoly. I think that the more folks that are involved in whether the academic or scientific or even the technology communities come together on this, I think the better. I would encourage the Galileo, that provided that they are there are legitimate, right? Because there are some that really don't follow the scientific process very much. I would recommend that as long as organizations out there that are committed to pursuing science in a scientific manner, then I would encourage that type of collaboration. Some would argue that's the reason why we are where we are today in this conversation over the last 4 years, because we are collaborating. We're not keeping the conversation within just a few trusted circles. Ultimately, this information belongs to everybody, and I think that's what we're committed to personally.
Well, Lou, let me take this opportunity to thank you for joining us. Always a pleasure, and I think this goes for all of you. You are doing divine work. You are making a big difference. On that note, Lou, thank you so much for
my pleasure. It's always a team effort. I can't take credit for it. So the two gentlemen you have here, Avi and Chris, deserve equal amount of credit and praise. They and there's a lot of others too that are working very diligently behind the scenes that haven't been in the public eye yet. But this is a team effort. Everybody's rowing. So thank you very much for that, Max, and thank you for what you do, Max. And thank you for your audience for tuning in. Obviously, that's an important piece of this, making sure that everybody is getting the same information. So, and Avi, always an honor and pleasure. Chris, great. What can I say? Great week, huh?
Oh,
keep up the good work, Lou.
Yes, sir. You got it, guys. Take care, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Work with you.
bye, Lou.
At the moment, we have $2 million in funding, the Galileo Project, and we aim at about 100 million, and that's really crucial. And I very much hope there will be partnership with organizations that can allow us to accomplish our task. And that's really the focus on my agenda, to try and raise the relevant funds for the project, so that we can really monitor enough of the sky to discover what is out there.
Yes, definitely. And I encourage all of our viewers and listeners, to support the Galileo Project and chip in, because it's really important to Mr. Mellon, as you might have read. Is this something that is important, that if we have knowledge on the phenomenon, we could back engineer it and possibly, enhance our technology?
Absolutely, in my mind. I mean, we're seeing objects that are using some kind of propulsion system that we don't understand. It's not the kind of thing that we use to power virtually any other aircraft. It's not combustion engineering. They're not inhaling oxygen and mixing it with fuel and igniting it. There's no air intake on a lot of these things. There's no exhaust. There's no wings. There's a lot of novel, if not radical, perhaps unknown to us technology being involved there. They could have all manner of extraordinary benefits if we're able to emulate it and understand it. So that's a ways off, but that is absolutely one of the potential long-term benefits.
For sure. Mr. Mellon, can I ask you, what was it that made you convinced that there's something penetrating our skies that shouldn't be there, or we just don't know what it is? Because when I talked to former Senator Reid, the first time he really took UAP seriously was when Mr. Bigelow sent him information. Now, he had already access to the Blue Book files, Grudge. What was it that made you convinced there's something to be investigated?
Well, two things really. I was participating as a consultant in some official meetings in the Pentagon when I became aware of the extraordinary number of incidents that were occurring off the East Coast. And when I pursued that and looked into it and actually talked to some of the Navy pilots personally, there was no question in my mind that this was going on. It was extensive. It had been going on for a long time, and nobody was doing anything about it. They weren't reporting it up the chain of command, much less trying to analyze it or understand it. So to me, that was a massive intelligence failure. It was totally unacceptable. It was lack of support for our people, and I was determined at that point to do whatever I could to try to correct the problem. As Dr. Loeb says, Avi said, it was kind of a case of the emperor's not wearing any clothes, and somebody's got to stand up and say, somebody's got to say that. So Lue and I were running around saying that all over, anywhere we could get an audience.
Right. Now, Ms. Gillibrand is also hinting towards a international collaboration on UAP investigation by governments, but also scientists. In your time, have you ever exchanged information with other governments, such as France, maybe, who have a very open program to UAP investigation, or maybe even adversarial nations like Russia?
Well, first of all, there's a fair bit of information sharing that's beginning to happen at the civilian level, non-classified level. Lue has visited a number of countries now in South America and in Europe to start conversations and exchange information. At the official government to government level, there's always some exchange of information with our allies, but very little, if any, specifically on this topic. So, one of our allies might say, we saw something unusual in this area, and it would go through normal reporting channels into the consumers. But typically, this phenomenon was not reported at all, even when it was observed, because of the potential effects on the careers of the people involved.
Right.
So there's been very little to date that was of any value or substance, and hopefully that's going to soon change.
For sure. Have you ever, you said that this was a huge security threat, but have there been moments that it was a direct threat to the United States or maybe another country?
Yeah, I want to be careful about the word threat. We have not seen any hostility. We've not seen any aggression. It's not that kind of a situation. It's a situation where you wake up in the morning and you see footprints through your house and they're not yours. And right. You realize there's a vulnerability there. Okay. So, if people are penetrating our air defense perimeters around carrier battle groups, there's something wrong. Doesn't mean there's any kind of imminent hostility, but that's not really acceptable. So, that's kind of the situation we're confronted with. In some cases lately, some of these actions have been fairly intrusive. Some of the reports in 2019 that were leaked to the media discussed objects that were at very close proximity to Navy ships, moving, following them for hours, sort of almost buzzing around them. Objects that seemingly wanted to provoke these ships. So it's kind of curious, who would be wanting to do that and why? There's this focus and attention on military assets as opposed to other incredible human inventions and devices. Seems a little bit concerning.
For sure. Avi, question for you. Of course, Mr. Mellon talked about very highly trained military men and women from the Navy and the Air Force who are witnesses, people collecting data through footage. Now, are these trained military men and women people you collaborate with on this project too? Because of course they're eyewitnesses. They can analyze from their trained perception. They recognize adversarial from friendly, but of course they can recognize something that is not military at all, something completely different. Isn't it interesting to use that knowledge for example, AI systems, analyzing systems?
Well, it's definitely good to converse and involve these people. And we do have a number of research affiliates of the project that had been witnessing things. So if you look at the Galileo Project website, you will see some of the research affiliates reported incidents. And the way I see it, it could be a mixed bag. You see that there are so many incidents that it's possible that most of them are either human-made or natural, but it's sufficient to have one, just one, that is out of this earth. The origin of the object is out of this earth, for this to have huge implications for humanity. And so we have to look at all of them with our best instruments and figure out their nature. And, you know, if the Galileo telescopes find the birds and take high-resolution images of birds, I'll be glad to transfer that information to zoologists. If they find the drones that have the label made in China or made in Russia in them, I'll be glad to transfer immediately the information to residents of Washington, D.C., because it's as boring as the images of birds, as far as I'm concerned. And we are looking for something else. And let's check, you know, rather than assume and ridicule the subject, that assume that we know the answer in advance. I think it's time for scientists to get engaged.
If I could add to that, I strongly share that view. It's been mystifying to me for decades why the scientific community and the government have not been more interested in this phenomenon, when we have hundreds of thousands of reports from around the world, from all manner of people, commercial airline pilots, the military, civilians, and so on, and scientists as well, as a matter of fact. And it is, as Avi said, if any one of those is extraterrestrial, that's all it takes. And then we're in a sort of a new environment, a new world. It's an incredible thing. So the individual incidents may have low probability, but enough incidents and enough research, we may find something that really is unique and transformational.
And you know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, it's worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book. I wouldn't need to write the book if we had a high-resolution image of Oumuamua.
Sure, but you know what's maybe even more worth than a picture? Some debris or biological material. So there have been always there have been the rumors. For example, when I did my interview with former Senator Harry Reid, he wasn't allowed access to Lockheed Martin or Skunk Works, and they were supposedly in possession of something exotic. Now, would that be something for the Galileo Project? Of course, you want the clear picture, but it would be nice to have some material to go along with that picture, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the example I often mention is of a caveman finding a cell phone, and the caveman is used to playing with rocks all of his life. And he would argue that this cell phone is just a rock of a type that I've never seen before. Just like my colleague said about Oumuamua, it's a rock of a type that we've never seen before. Hydrogen iceberg, nitrogen iceberg, cloud of dust particles. But that's the natural approach that you take to something new. But then if the caveman would press a button, he would realize that it records his voice, and press another button, records his image, and it would be clear that this is not a rock. And so what we really need is to put our hands on such a thing. And, you know, there would be nothing more thrilling to me than to put my hands on a piece of equipment that is out of this earth. You know, imagine what, I always love gadgets. I have the latest gadgets that we produce. But if I were to encounter a gadget that was produced by a civilization that is 1,000,000 times more advanced than us, or, you know, that sort of represents our future, I would be thrilled. It's just like I would be like a kid in a candy store.
Yes, I can imagine that. Mr. Mellon, when you were on duty for the government, have you ever thought that, let's say, the secret services, the multiple secret services, were working on separate islands, not sharing information? Hasn't there ever been an effort, or have you ever tried to combine that information and maybe even now use, because my feeling is this: everything that's still classified cannot be shared with science yet. But if, like, for example, what Ms. Gillibrand is doing, and you can pile up all this information onto one centralized system, it would be so much more easy, I guess, for the science to compare whatever is at hand and work with. Now, is this something you or Ms. Gillibrand are lobbying for?
Well, absolutely. That's part of the intent of her amendment to help overcome what you refer to as these different stovepipes. It's a huge problem. When 9/11 occurred in the aftermath and that was analyzed, one of the conclusions was if FBI and CIA had been sharing information, they might have been able to prevent that tragedy, right? And so this is a very similar situation, only it's more extensive and worse because there are many more agencies that have relevant information, not just CIA and FBI. So it's crucial from the government national security standpoint, at least, to start bringing the puzzle pieces and putting them in one room on one table and putting them together. And the more of that information we can share with the scientific community as well, the better.
Yes.
Max, I stopped you before when you asked Chris about last week. Maybe you want to get into that.
Mr. Mellon?
Well, the Lue and I were in DC most of the week in support of the Gillibrand Amendment, and speaking consulting with different people on the Hill and in the executive branch, and trying to do whatever we could to be of assistance. And we had a good, meaningful time down there, and we're tentatively optimistic.
Well, that's great. I had the feeling when I saw Ms. Gillibrand's speech a couple of weeks ago that she had been extended some more information than, let's say, usual, that might have convinced her a bit more to push this. Could that be true by any chance, Mr. Mellon?
She has some very good staff people.
Had any help from scientists? We were talking about NASA, for example. Have they ever reacted to your, public, cry for more funds or support?
Well, before I established the Galileo Project, I did submit a proposal to NASA. I haven't heard back. I very much hope that they would be interested in a collaboration. And the same is true for, major companies such as Blue Origins or SpaceX and others. But we currently are pushing forward, with the money we have. And it would be nice if we had $100 million. That would allow us to basically accomplish our goals. By scientific standards, this is not a huge sum of money compared to other scientific projects. For example, the Large Hadron Collider cost $10 billion. And we were hoping to find new physics. It confirmed the Higgs, which we already knew about, didn't find the nature of dark matter, didn't find supersymmetry. So here is an example of a project that cost $10 billion. I'm saying for 1% of that budget, we can make huge advances in our knowledge about equipment flying near Earth. Wouldn't that be worth it? And of course, the federal agencies may be constrained, but the private sector is not. So I'm very much hopeful that there would be individuals that will come forward and support the project. We are committed to doing a very rigorous scientific work, and they will be proud of it.
Sure. Haven't you ever talked to Mr. Bigelow?
No. I usually, you see, I was not engaged in fundraising. People came to me and suggested their help. And that is remarkable to me because, I was department chair for 9 years of the astronomy department at Harvard, and I know the landscape. Usually you have to work very hard to invite people to dinners and convince them that they should support you. And I didn't do any of that. I got an email from the administrator of my department back in June saying, you have a new research fund. And I say, what do you mean can you tell me who gave me the money? And she said, I don't know. I have to check with the Harvard Development Office. It took them a day. I told them, look, I need to know who gave me the money because I want to thank that person. It's an elementary request as far as I'm concerned. They gave me the name. And so that's unusual. You see that people are so passionate about the subject. They're willing to fund it without even telling me that they gave the money. And that's the way we got the money for the Galileo project so far. And I very much hope that there will be additional people inspired by the vision. It's not for me to go around and try to recruit them. It's for them to come forward and tell me this is something we really resonate with.
Sure. Avi, have you ever considered trying to get access to, in a formal way, to, for example, the James Webb Telescope, which is going to be launched? Because there are systems already at hand. Are you trying to gain access to those?
So it's not just the James Webb Space Telescope. There is the Vera Rubin Observatory that would be much more sensitive than Pan-STARRS and could discover an Oumuamua-like object every few months. You see, and it will start operations in less than 2 years. And we are planning to construct a pipeline software that will analyze objects that the Vera Rubin Observatory finds in the sky, and will identify those that look like Oumuamua. And we will use the alert from the Vera Rubin Observatory to design a space mission that will carry a camera and get a close-up photograph of such an object, just like Oumuamua. So that's one example of an observatory that we plan to work with. Another is, of course, James Webb. And I should say, I was part of the first advisory committee that designed the James Webb Space Telescope. It was called the Next Generation Space Telescope back 3 decades ago. And I was, at the time, working on the first stars, the first galaxies. It was designed as an infrared telescope to look for the first galaxies, the first stars in the universe. It's the biblical story of Genesis, except dressed up in scientific terms. How was the first light produced? And that was the original purpose, but now we can use the James Webb Space Telescope to look at other things like exoplanets, to see if perhaps we can tell what their atmosphere is made of. And we can also look at an Oumuamua-like object with much better sensitivity than the Spitzer Space Telescope. So we definitely plan to do that. And there are other instruments, in addition to those two that I mentioned, that we plan to use.
Sure. To elaborate on the Mom of the Year a little bit more, Ms. Gillibrand. Now, she has, I think, stated that she is looking to work with the Galileo Project, I think, or she is heading toward that. Mr. Mellon, you wouldn't have anything to do with that, would you?
If I did, I wouldn't acknowledge it.
Okay. All right. But is there a chance that through Ms. Gillibrand, there is a possible collaboration between maybe not just the Galileo Project, but also Sky-Hub or other organizations? Is that something they're actively pursuing?
Well, I should say that there are members of Sky-Hub that are among our research affiliates. With respect to the Galileo Project collaborating, I should say we are limited to open data. So if there would be data that will be declassified, we definitely would be glad to look into it. And of course, there is the advisory committee that we will be given, hopefully, the privilege of selecting 3 members of. And in that way, I think it's a great recognition of the value of the Galileo Project. I find it heartwarming that people in Washington, D.C. decided to acknowledge the Galileo Project in an amendment to the Senate. And I should say I was not actively lobbying for that. Once again, just like these wealthy individuals that showed up on the porch of my home, this came as a surprise to me. And, it reminds me again of what happened with the publicist of my book in the UK. The publicist said, Avi, great job. You are selling the book very well with all your podcast appearances and public outreach. And I corrected him. I said, look, I'm not trying to sell the book. You have to understand that. I'm trying to convey a message. And if that message was not popular in the public eyes, the book wouldn't sell and I wouldn't change my message as a result. I'm not trying to accomplish a commercial purpose, a benefit. And he said, sorry, I didn't really mean that, but he understood. And the same is true here. I'm trying to advocate for a cause that appears to me as important for the future of humanity. We have to do that. We have to do it as scientists. We have to do it also as politicians in Washington, D.C. And the fact that people agree to follow that path, to me, is an illustration that it's common sense. There is nothing really contrived about it. The fact that the scientific community occasionally resists it is a surprise to me. But that's a side subject.
Sure. Last question for you, Mr. Mellon. I know I've been taking way too much of your time. It's actually from my friend Lue Elizondo, the unidentified celebrity review. Your colleague Lou was a guest many times over there in that show. He wants to ask the question: if you think, sir, if of grassroots political efforts like the Big Phone Home, that was his project, was a great effort to create awareness through podcast. Or UK Media UK initiative are part of, for say, the public awareness of UAP, of creating awareness of that there's something out there and we should know about. Because I'm saying this because you were the one who actually extended footage to the New York Times in 2017 and made the first big leap to what's going on right now.
Well, I think all of that is helpful, and I think it's important. I will say that I followed a particular course of action very carefully with Capitol Hill, and it was primarily a discussion about national security. It wasn't a discussion about science, and it wasn't a discussion about extraterrestrials. And that was very deliberate because of the stigma is so bad that these members couldn't even approach it if you didn't provide some cover, some defensible way for them to be able to talk about it and engage. And that's a subject that all Americans care about, national security, and rightly so. And there's a very genuine national security component to this. So that is kind of what got the members really to engage when they met with these Navy pilots and they looked them in the eye. And those airmen told them what their experiences had been. I would say that's in terms of effect on the members and getting them to engage. You notice Bill Nelson, the director of NASA, has been talking about that. That's because he was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee when we pushed to get those pilots in there and have those briefings. And by good luck, he is now the director of NASA, and it's obviously had a huge effect on his thinking. So I think everybody's efforts to advance the conversation and get the information out are helpful and contribute and positive, and I support all that. But in terms of the actual impact on the legislators, I think first and foremost, it's been the Navy and the military and the national security argument.
And wow. I wanted to also salute Bill Nelson for bringing this subject to the forefront. And even before the ODNI report came, about a month before that, he made statements on CNN and elsewhere that scientists should engage. And that's at least what inspired me to go ahead with the Galileo Project, because I completely agree with him. And I think it takes courage for him to come out with such a statement.
Well, yeah, Mr. Mellon, to elaborate on Bill Nelson, he has actually stated, this could be extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great. He's got an open mind. It's wonderful. We need more of that. I think, of course, it could be extraterrestrial. I've written about that. I've written about the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I think if you look at the unclassified report that was presented from the intelligence community, that hypothesis fits the data better than any other hypothesis that I'm aware of. But, that's not proof of anything. Sure. That's informed speculation. And so what really counts is ultimately getting the data and that scientists can use and to really find out for certain rather than just be speculating about what's going on.
For the conservatives in the audience, we can call it other.
Evidence that whatever we are noticing in the skies could be extraterrestrial. And how can we convince the biggest skeptics? Because in Holland, I'm going to tell you, gents, Dutch people will only believe if there's an alien or an extraterrestrial, if it spits in its mouth in his mouth and slaps him across the face. That's when a Dutch guy will believe this could be ET. How in the hell can you, what would be the best evidence to have to convince the general public if it would be extraterrestrial?
Well, I do think that the most important goal should be to demonstrate to the scientific community that it's unusual, not natural. And by the way, it's not a matter of popularity contest. Even though Galileo was not popular at the time, it turned out that the Earth moves around the sun. And when we design space missions today, we don't remember who the philosophers were that argued otherwise. So it's not, we don't need to convince everyone. What we need to do is provide enough evidence that to anyone interested in the evidence, it will be convincing beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just like in court, you have to convince the judges that are looking at the evidence. And once we do that, then I think everything will change, because instead of it being what some people call speculation, there will be direct evidence for it, and anyone that wants to look at the evidence will be able to. So it's really about open data that is available to everyone, that is very convincing. And in principle, science can get that.
What would it convince you, Avi?
Oh, if we have a high-resolution image that shows bolts and screws and buttons that you can press, if it doesn't look like a rock, it's not a rock. I mean, it's really simple. You don't need a very sophisticated mathematics to figure this out. I mean, a kid can figure it out. And my point is that if we want to understand reality, it's not about demonstrating that we are smart. It's about collecting the evidence that will guide us. And somehow the situation was twisted in academia, where you're supposed to show that you are smart rather than try to figure out reality. So I think the priorities should be first to figure out reality, collecting data that will guide us, rather than demonstrating that we are smart. We know the answer in advance. We know that Oumuamua may have been a nitrogen iceberg without having any direct evidence for that.
All right. And you, Mr. Mellon?
Your comment about the Dutch people, we have a similar expression here. We say he's from Missouri. And there are a lot of people here that you're never going to convince, short of something really in their faces, as you mentioned. But we don't need to do that or attempt to do that. What we need to do is convince the mainstream, provide data that's compelling. I think photographic data can be extremely powerful and visceral. And I also think there's other data. For example, if we release data and the scientific community is able to validate it, that shows objects entering the Earth's atmosphere and maneuvering and exiting the Earth's atmosphere, we're going to know pretty quickly whether those are ours or not. And I think if we're able to, the scientific community is able to see that kind of data and validate it, that will start, those kinds of things will move the conversation to a whole new level.
Well, I have heard that what has been observed, that they come through our atmosphere and even submerge in water. I don't know if it hasn't been really, there's no data for that, I think, not accessible to us anyway, but would that be something, Avi, to be a smoking gun to you if you see something coming through the atmosphere?
Definitely, because most natural interpretation of these objects that are near military bases, near nuclear reactors, is that these are surveillance equipment that is surveying, that is human-made. But if it comes from outside the atmosphere, it's very unlikely to be human-made. You see, it came from somewhere else. And in principle, we can also see it with our satellites. We can see it with telescopes that are away from Earth. And of course, if we see something like that, the only natural object that does it are meteors. These are rocks that enter the atmosphere and burn up. And if they're bigger than the size of a person, something is left off them when they hit the ground. But they actually are colliding with the Earth. They don't maneuver. And in principle, you can find them and look at them. So we can tell the difference between meteors and equipment. Definitely.
Okay. Now, Very last question. I always ask people who are on my podcast talking about your EP. Have you had an experience for the both of you, gentlemen?
That's an easy one for me. Yeah, the answer is no.
Yeah,
Okay,
same for me.
that's
No. And by the way, I was also asked whether I like science fiction. And actually, in the event in Washington, Jeff Bezos said that he was inspired by Star Trek. And Avril Haines was sitting next to me, and she said, I also loved Star Trek. And I said, I didn't like Star Trek because the storyline violated laws of physics that I'm aware of. It didn't make sense. I couldn't enjoy it. And she said,
so does UAP.
well, okay, but Star Trek is not based on observations, okay? And she said, we have to work on you. But the truth is, I was never a fan of science fiction, and I've never experienced something like that myself, except, of course, for the data that we collected on Oumuamua, which looks weird.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for being on this podcast, on my podcast. You've really extended so much great information, and you educated us for more than an hour. I would like to, of course, extend an open invitation to come back anytime.